friends. Welcome back again to another episode of Conservation Stories. This is a podcast hosted by the Sandhill Area Research Association, otherwise known as SARA. I'm your host, Tillery Timmons-Sims, and I have with me again my brother. I've decided that Dusty Timmons and I, should see if we can make one more podcast without arguing. I think we did pretty good last time. And we have asked Kelly Mulville. Kelly is a viticulturist who manages the Paicines Ranch vineyard, and he is all things regenerative grape growing, I guess you would say. And this is why we have Dusty here, because Dusty is the past president of TWIGA, the Texas Wine
Grape Growers Association.
Thank you very much. And so he's going to ask the smart questions, and I'm going to ask the dumb questions. And Kelly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate you joining us from California. This is early morning for you, and thank you very much. Can you give us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into viticulture?
Sure. I was born in West Texas. We were on the edge of farming. In fact, the house my dad built, he was an architect, was a cotton field where he built that. So I grew up around agriculture. We did a little bit of market farming. I started in organic growing early on. Ended up going to UC Santa Cruz to the program in ecological horticulture, which was at that time kind of the only place you could learn organic farming practices. And then shortly after that, I ended up running across Alan Savory. From that point, I ended up going to a wine tasting when I was working on a ranch, a very small town in Colorado, and realized that there's some really good wine out there. And that caused me to shift gears a bit. And next thing I knew, I was in Southeast Arizona putting in a vineyard. And that started my journey of trying to take all my background in organic agriculture and range restoration using livestock, finding all of those into wine growing, which landed me eventually in California.
That is really fascinating. And can you tell us a little bit about Paicines Ranch and where you're working now?
Sure. So Paicines Ranch was originally a Mexican land grant. It's been in operation since 1846. And sometimes I feel like I've been there most of that time. Yeah, I've only been here 10 years, and I was the owner of this ranch, Sally Calhoun, and I knew of each other basically when I was in California before working on vineyards. But she came to a presentation I did at Eco Farm on some work that I'd done with converting basically a kind of a more conventional trellised vineyard to a system that allowed it to be grazed at any time of year. And I did that initial trial and research in California, and ended up writing an article on that was published in Australia and New Zealand Grape Brewer Winemaker. And so consequently, I was invited to do presentations down there. But after going down and doing that, I realized that I was kind of trying to modify a system that was never meant to be grazed throughout the year, and that it was a bit clunky. And so I've done a presentation at Eco Farm Conference here in California, right near Paicines Ranch. And Sally was at that. And at that, I said, what we really need to do is look at how we are designing vineyards and how we might potentially redesign vineyards to be ultimately more diverse and sustainable, especially in the face of changing climate and loss of biodiversity. And so Sally came up to me after that and said, I want to do what you're talking about at Paicines Ranch. And I said, well, here's the thing. I don't really know how to do it. I'd be happy to jump on this opportunity, but it's going to be a learning journey for all of us, which it has been. But she invited me to come out and be part of this operation. And so I've been working on this ever since.
I've never met Miss Calhoun, but I've heard a lot of good things about her investment in research and the things that she does on that ranch. It's pretty impressive.
It certainly is. She's a an incredible forest but just amazingly down to earth person.
I've did a little bit of reading back on what you're doing there. Can you walk us through basically the nuts and bolts of going from the bare ground to the decisions you made on your corn on height training system, and even all the way into what type of livestock do you run underneath in the canopy?
Okay, great question, and it's always good to start from the beginning. The ranch is 7,600 acres. 600 acres of that are irrigated cropland, and the remainder is rangeland. So we're Central Coast California, inland a bit, 12 inches average rainfall a year, and it seems like it's either we're getting 3 inches or we're getting 20 inches.
So it's very similar to us out here.
And it's funny because when I went to UC Santa Cruz from West Texas, I got claustrophobia in the redwoods.
That's funny.
Anyway, historically, for 30 years, there were 1,000 acres of vineyards on this ranch, and they'd been removed in about 1995. So when I selected a spot, I looked around at the terrain and realized that the place that perennials are growing in this climate, in this location, are on the north-facing slopes, because that's where they have a little bit of shade. They don't dry out as quickly. And so I purposely selected a hill, which is predominantly north-facing. The first thing we did was, we didn't have to do much because it was pretty bare. The ground was not in great shape. So we leveled it out. We did an application of compost, and that was it. When the rains came, we ran cattle on there in the spring to graze down the vegetation and get some manure and urine on the site to help building the soil health. That first year, we had 7 animal days per acre, which means that we had basically the equivalent of 7,000-pound cows on 1 acre for 1 day. The next year, we added cover crop seed and had about the same rainfall, and our productivity increased tenfold. And I think that was for 2 reasons. One is that compost that we applied the first year had a chance to get kind of vitalized in the soil, and then that cover crop provided additional forage. The next year was the last year we grazed, so this is year 3, and we had similar animal days per acre, actually a little bit higher because we also started incorporating sheep into the picture. We ended up lambing on the site that was going to be the first phase of the vineyard. So before even planting anything, we were building the soil health. And the interesting thing when you look at that scenario is we did that while bringing in some income at the same time. So it wasn't all about just bringing in a bunch of inputs. The primary input was a little bit of compost and a little bit of seed, and then having the livestock. Livestock took those the initial boost from those things and compacted it. 2017, we planted the first vines, and we got our first crop in 2021. And this year we had our 4th crop. So because I did not know exactly what I was going to do for a trellis system, I'd initially thought about using a system called DOV, which means dried on the vine, which is used by raisin producers in California. It takes a lot of infrastructure. It's fairly massive. I realized pretty quickly that it probably would not do well on a hill. And so about that time, as fate would have it, I was at a workshop, a viticultural workshop, and my friend Fritz Westnover, who's based in Texas.
You know him, Dusty?
I worked with him at AgriLife.
AgriLife. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know Fritz very well. Fritz
got called up to do a presentation on the spur of the moment because somebody got food poisoning who was supposed to present. He just said, I think I have some slides, and went and checked out a bunch of people that Fritz recommended that were using the Watson system. Came back and decided that's what I was going to do. And so it's a high trellis. It's a divided canopy. It's the vine density less, but the yields are better than, say, a conventional VSP system. So there's a lot of things in favor of what we were trying to do. And when I say what we're trying to do, sometimes people mistakenly think that we were just trying to figure out a way to graze sheep in a vineyard during the growing season. But actually, it's much bigger than that. The ultimate goal is, how do we restore biodiversity to a landscape that has been denuded, which is the case of most agriculture. I mean, we take a site, we clear it basically of everything, and then we usually plant a crop of something. And if we get a little bit better, we might have a crop rotation. And then if we get even a little bit better than that, we might have a diversity of crops growing at the same time. Ultimately, we were trying to figure out how we support the native biodiversity here at the same time as we produce a crop profitably. So that's the goal here. And we just realized from my initial work in setting up a vineyard to graze during the summer by putting in electric offsets, that the benefits are pretty substantial. Like that early work I did was in around 2009 to 2011. And we were seeing per acre savings of approximately $1,000 per year. In this area, the average size vineyard is about 1,000 acres. So if you use those numbers that are now almost 14 years old or so, savings would be $1 million a year. The economics has to work for everything in agriculture. That was a big indication that we're on the right track.
Let me go back and ask a couple of little questions in here. It's interesting that I didn't realize that it came from the Watson training system. I think he had just got that perfected pretty much when I was with Extension. This has been, I don't even remember the dates. I'm just lucky if I can remember to get up in the morning. I consider that a win. So whenever it was, I was down there. When you looked at the Watson training system and trying to figure out how to graze underneath the system, you mentioned the divided canopy. Can you go ahead and explain kind of what the divided canopy is for our listeners? Sure.
If you're in a vineyard and you're looking at the row ends from the end posts, you have an end post that's coming up pretty high, and on top of that is a V. Ultimately, as you get into the vineyard, all of your grape stakes have a V. But what that means is that your vine get trained up pretty high. Our cordon height is probably averages around 66 inches. So you have basically, the trunk of your vine going up to just before 66 inches, and then it does a Y. So it spreads in two directions, and those create arms. And so when those are pruned, it looks just like a giant T standing out in the field. Now, in the growing season, when the shoots start to grow out of those two arms off of the T, we select for spurs on either side of that so that they're going both ways into the row. They accentuate that V pattern, and they come up on the trellis wires, and they create a V, and then they droop over and hang into the row. And so if you're looking down the row, which when you're in full production and later in the season, what you see is basically this V shape of foliage draping down on either side of your trellis. And actually what tends to happen in practice is that those shoots, depending on the variety, some of them grow out, and that creates a kind of almost a complete overhead canopy. A lot of them, though, just go out fairly far into the row, and it creates this big umbrella-like effect, which provides a lot of nice shade for sheep, for people that are working in there, and for the vineyard floor. Because of that creates cooler conditions, dappled light on the fruit, which is ideal. And in our climate, which can get pretty hot, that shade, both for the fruit and on the vineyard floor, keeps things nice and cool in there.
That's really cool. So, Dusty, do we have any Watson?
No.
We don't. I was going to say, I've never seen that here.
Watson, it was developed for Black Spanish.
Okay.
A non-vinifera. I mean, this is the matter of fact, when I was with Extension and we're looking at it, it was exclusively for non-vinifera. So like your Cabernets and Tempranillos and Grenache and Gewürztraminers and stuff like that did not have, everybody was conventional.
Okay.
at that time, with the industry being young out here, I kept telling everybody, let's do what's in the box first. Before we start thinking outside the box.
Right. So let me follow up one more with the question that I think other people might be wondering about the term VSV system. Can one of y'all, Dusty, can you just give us a real quick?
I think that's
so people will be
VSP.
VSP, okay.
Vertical shoot positioning.
Okay.
That is a spur and cordon typical.
Just the way it normally, just what we see around here in West Texas.
It's vertically. You basically position the shoots vertically.
Okay.
It's grape guys are ingenious about how they do things, but not so much with how we name things. Yeah.
So this is basically the way that we typically prune things here. Yes.
Probably 98% of the stuff in Texas is done this way, and the other 2% is what we call a southwestern sprawl. Or, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
I mean, there's some smart dicing, but very, very little, like 2 vineyards in the state do smart dicing.
And Kelly, you were here just recently.
Yep, I was in August.
That's what I was thinking. The hot time of the year. Although I think every part of the year is hot time now. It feels like it anyway. So, Kelly, what were your thoughts when you were up here and you spent a few days?
I did. Yep. And I stopped there. Actually, I was coming back from Oklahoma to California, and I stopped there in part because I've developed a big interest in cotton, and I wanted to see what folks were doing in that big cotton patch over there.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to get out of it.
Yeah. So so I spent some time running around and visiting with. I think they were primarily organic growers.
Mm-hmm. You met Jeremy Brown.
I did. Yep.
Yeah.
Carl Pepper.
Oh yeah. Yep. That's that's the OG organic grower right there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. One of those original guys. Yes, exactly.
Was kind of driving around with a guy named Ido Tal, who's a cotton breeder from Israel.
Out here, our cordons, we like I said, we're pretty much predominantly VSP out here. One of the things that we have done, and it kind of started it started 100% at our vineyard, and is we use hail net, because we have, hail is a pretty big problem for us there with the continental climate. I always say that we're, all we need to have the perfect climate to grow grapes is the Pacific Ocean, 90 miles west of us. But with the continental climate, you have hailstorms, and they can come in and be pretty severe. We've started hanging hail net in our vineyards, which it's a side netting. It's similar to shade netting they use in some of the vineyards up in Napa is where I've seen it used. It's similar to that, but different because we're cheap, and so we try to do it as inexpensively as possible. But have you ever looked at protecting the canopy from the side like that, and then being able to run sheep in, graze livestock in it with a conventional trellis system by just protecting the canopy from the grazers or browsers, I guess is what it would be? So
I'm familiar with what you're talking about, and I've seen people actually using a similar setup for heat intense sunlight protection. And so that's definitely a possibility and could be a side benefit for folks using that system, and that they potentially graze that pretty easily. The reason that I didn't do that in the vineyard here is because I had free range to figure out something that would provide additional benefits, and I didn't want to try and make a Volkswagen Bug or Mercedes. What I was trying to do is not just take an existing system and see how we make it a little bit better. Let's reverse that and say, what would be the ultimate setup for providing things like improved shade, improved access of the sheep to the vines, because I actually want the sheep to be able to browse all of the suckers for me. And so standing back and saying, is what we're doing actually working for the bigger picture that we're trying to achieve? And it's so easy to get caught up in. I mean, the first vineyard I put in Arizona was VSP. The first vineyard I designed actually was VSP, but then I just, it was a gradual process of realizing that there's different ways we can do this.
When you look at what they've used, in other places in the world, where they have grazed livestock through the vineyards, in times past. And we've gone more in towards, everything is every field is a dedicated field for a dedicated crop. When we pull that we've pulled that diversity out, like the vineyard, like in our vineyard, for example, up here, our rains have fall at weird times comparatively to, like, say, where it falls in California. California, you got the rains throughout the winter and then it's dry in the summer, and we always hope for rains in the winter, but we never count on them. This has been an unusual year. We've had, I think our vineyard this month has had 7 inches of rainfall, and I have got just scads of erosion that I've got to deal with. But we've moved, what I'm trying to do in looking at our vineyards is, we try to put a cover crop on our alleys in our rows, but we feel like we don't have enough rainfall to grow a cover crop without, substantial irrigation. We don't have enough irrigation to grow a grape crop with a cover crop in the vineyard. If that makes sense. I'm kind of talking in circles a little bit here. That is something that comes up a lot, Dusty. Like even when we're talking to different, like we've done a round table with different producers, and some of them, are willing to put some irrigation, but most of them it's completely, cover crops are rain dependent. Yeah. I think the thing that excited me the most when Tillery asked me to be on this with you was the very first thing I did, I always do when somebody says, oh, you got to hear about this is a regenerative agriculture, is the very first thing I do is I go look at where they are and I go find rainfall charts. Mm-hmm, exactly. And when I saw your rainfall charts, I thought, this guy might actually have something that we could work with, because regenerative agriculture works exceptionally well with 36 to 44 inches of rainfall a year. Well, and it depends on what you're calling regenerative and who's telling you what, and right. But going back, when you were talking about weeds, and when I was in college, the weed professor was always like, a weed is a plant that is out of place. Mm-hmm. A rose bush in a cotton field is a weed. Is basically how the theory went. When you're looking at your biodiversity, you said that you went in, leveled the side, and then put out compost and grazed cattle the next year. You just graze whatever. I'm going to call them weeds because that's going to be what we're going to go with on this thing. Did you just graze whatever happened to come up on that hillside of weeds, grass, neighborhood would come up on that hillside that year? And then you said the next year you went back in and planted a cover crop. What did you plant back into that site when you on the second year?
Yep. So to answer your question, yes, it was just whatever came up. It was basically, we get a lot of annual grasses. Some of them are okay to graze. Some of them are not that great. So it was just grazing whatever was in there. But we're using holistic plant grazing, so we had pretty good density, and we're moving the cattle pretty often. So 7 animal days per acre. And so that would be the equivalent of each acre getting 7 animals for a day. That's just a figure we use to talk about forage production. It might be 13 animals or something, but when you calculate it out, that's what it comes to. So then in the second year, we planted a cover crop, and that included oats, which is kind of funny because we do have we have oats that come up as weeds, as you would term them. And but we planted some forage oats, radish, probably peas, and vetch, and possibly maybe some barley or something in there too.
You gave your biodiversity a head start with the variety of seeds that you put on that.
Exactly. And I will say before I even selected this site, we were doing a botanical survey of the ranch. And on that site, we counted 11 species of plants, including 1 perennial. And just to jump forward, we are now at over 100 species of plants on the vineyard.
That was the next question I was going to ask you, is if you'd seen an increase in the biodiversity in it. How tight do you graze it during the season? And I'll get to where I'm going with this here in just a minute. But like when I say how tight, how far down do you graze it? Do you graze it hard back, hard and make sure everything gets eaten uniformly across it and then move them? Or do you let it selectively graze it and move them through it that way?
I'm going to go to that old standby answer. It depends.
Are you sure you're not an economist?
Well, that depends. I do like things to make economic sense for sure, but I wouldn't call myself an economist. So that's the great thing about thinking of grazing as a tool, is that really, what are you trying to achieve? And so, for instance, this year we had a big vole outbreak, and if I'd known how voles function, I would have gone in right before the vines started greening up, when we had the chance to easily graze everything, including some of the young vines that were in there. I would have grazed severely, so grazed it down pretty hard, and then that would have reduced the habitat for the voles. So we have that option. We have that option of grazing severely. But in general, during the winter when we're grazing, we will graze probably down about halfway or so, because we want to keep the photosynthetic capacity of the plant that's being grazed. We want to keep that high. If you graze it down to the ground, you're going to reduce the photosynthetic capacity, and you're going to be sacrificing roots to recover. So the plant's going to have to sacrifice roots in order to be able to recover. So if we don't sacrifice roots and we keep that photosynthetic capacity going, that is an engine that is pumping carbon and root exudates into the soil and feeding the soil biology. So it just kind of depends on what you're trying to achieve at any moment. And also if it's particularly wet in the winter, which we generally don't have to deal with, but it seems like it's either going to be really wet or pretty dry. We will kind of try and delay having the animals out there for a while. And if we do just need to put them in there, we will move them pretty quickly, because you can increase compaction in wet soil quickly.
Yeah, that would be another, because there's a reason that a sheepfoot packer is what they use to pack roads down. Compaction is an issue that we are beginning to see in vineyards out here in Texas. Our soils are typically a lot of sand. We're where the vast majority of the vineyards are grown it's predominantly a sandy loam, or a loamy fine sand actually. And so you don't have as much compaction in there, but just below the A horizon, you typically have an increase in clay, and we're seeing compaction down at about 16 to 24 inches, and it's impacting. We didn't think it was impacting our grape production until we went out and we did something to counteract that. Basically, we did a relatively deep ripping. We ripped it about 24 inches deep. And for 2 years, this is the second year that we've done it. And you could still, even last year, you could tell walking down the row how much better soil tilth you had in those rows where we had fought that compaction. So compaction was another one I was not concerned about, but I was curious about. When you said you had increased it to, what did you say, 111 different species of plants?
Yeah, a little over 100.
Well, just call it 100 plus. When you see that, are you seeing an increase in? Is there any kind of an increase in a native versus a non-native plants that invasive? Are you seeing any problems with invasive species coming in and out competing some of the more native species that are native to your region in California? The
quick answer to that is no. But we are seeing things that people would consider invasive. For instance, we now have some of the vines have Bermuda grass growing underneath them. We have some perennial western wheatgrass growing underneath some of the vines. We have coyote bush, which is a native that was the one perennial that was on the site before we planted. And we have Peruvian pepper trees. We have elderberry trees. We refer to this every year. It seems like there's a different thing happening. And last year was the year of trees popping up, and including palm trees.
What?
And so it's like when you manage for diversity, you get it all.
Oh
man, here I was worried about nutsedge, and we've got nutsedge in a part of our vineyard, and at least I don't have palm trees.
Wow.
Of course, we'd have Chinese elms coming up in ours. We actually have Chinese, but
Yeah. So we have a lot of stuff, and let me kind of stand back a little bit. So we started out with 11 species. We did cover crop for the first few years. We haven't cover cropped in 4 years. One of the reasons that I quit cover cropping is because we had 2 severe drought years, including the driest year in recorded history in California, which 2 years later was followed by the wettest year in history.
It all evens out.
Yeah. So when you talk about weather extremes, like I know you guys experience in Texas, we've got them here too for sure. So the thing that I realized, so I quit planting cover crops just because I could not predict what was going to happen in the year, and losing a cover crop 2 years in a row, it adds up monetarily, and so. But the thing that was happening, even though we weren't getting the cover crop germinating, we were getting natives and some of the introduced stuff germinating, and so we still had good ground cover. So at that point I said, well, why even bother with cover crops? It's kind of like it was a good way to prime the engine, but now the engine seems to be self-driving, and we're still seeing an increase of 5 to 10 species every year. Of new species coming in. A lot of those are native stuff. Some of them are interesting things like narrow-leaf milkweed, which is one of the favorite foods of monarch butterflies. And that is toxic to livestock, so the sheep don't mess with it. And we have all kinds of insects buzzing around that. And then we'll see other natives coming in. Now, I will say that last year we received a grant to do some native plantings. And so we planted some native stuff, native perennials that would end up coming in here, like the trees did, by birds. And they're primarily varieties that need a little bit of shade. And now that we have a little bit of shade happening on the property, things like a native honeysuckle and stuff, we're just planting this stuff. And the grant was to put in a hedgerow. And I told the guy who got the grant and pulled it together, who runs Wild Farm Alliance, when he said, hey, we need to come out and plan your hedgerow. And I said, I've decided we're not doing a hedgerow. And he said, well, you got all the grant money. You got to do it. I said, no, I'm still planting, but I'm just going to plant everything right inside the vineyard, underneath the vines. And there was a long pause, and he said, God, that's a great idea. And he said, so we'll see how it works. And they're doing fine, except for the things that got taken out by voles.
Yeah, they're doing fine, except for the things that nature killed. Go figure.
Right. Yeah.
I say that completely tongue in cheek, but anyway, I was going to ask you. You said you planted native honeysuckle. The honeysuckle, I'm sure that 99% of our listeners are thinking of is what we grow out here. That is a very big vine, and it gets big and brambly, and
you plant that on your
everything.
you plant that on your back fence.
Yes, you plant it on the back fence so it'll climb up it. Is it? Are we talking the same kind of growing habit, or is it a low growing, running? What does it look like?
It's a climber, but it's not nearly as vigorous as the honeysuckle we know from Texas.
Okay, I guess I'm assuming that since you're grazing livestock in there, they'll pretty much keep it off of anything that's growing at eye level, because they're going to be, hey, look, there's something to eat right there. Has it been growing long enough to see if it's going to climb up and get into your cordons, or is it, or if it has not been long enough, are you anticipating that being an issue that you're going to have to look at?
It hasn't made it up that far, but so far I haven't noticed it being browsed, and so we hope that it will make it up to the cordon, and because it's kind of the opposite of the honeysuckle we're talking about, in that it's a very fine plant. It's small leaf, and I think it would be kind of a very compatible in the trellis, actually. So, but we just have a few of those plants. If it's problematic, then we'll take it out. But I think that I have no problem with having an additional vine in there. And this year, I think I will try planting probably some beans in with the vines, just to see how they do. Yep.
What's the benefit? What's the benefit of having? Is it just the fact that it's just diverse, or is there other benefits of having something else having another viney plant growing in there?
One of them is the flowers. And so, like another one that I would like to do is the name, it's like an Aztec bean, a scarlet runner.
Yes.
And so it's a great attractant for hummingbirds. And hummingbirds are kind of territorial. They chase the other birds off. So we are, I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have so many hummingbirds that we don't have to put up bird netting. But in the meantime, it'll be a fun little experiment. And so it's kind of this constant thing. And, it's a legume is a nitrogen fixer. Not that we are low on nitrogen. Having sheep graze the vineyard in the summer, we actually never have to apply nitrogen. So that urine being deposited in the vineyard during the growing season of the plant is providing plenty of nitrogen for the vines.
Yeah.
What
are you predominantly sandy soil, rocky soil? What does your soil profile look like?
The soil is technically, according to the NRCS, is technically considered Diablo clay. But it's pretty diverse. We have some spots that are a little more kind of a tight loam, but in general, it's fairly heavy clay in spots. We also have calcified river or ocean rocks in the soil profile. A lot of fossilized clams. And the soil surface is considered extremely deficient in calcium. And when you go down about 2 feet, we have excessive calcium. So we see a little bit of calcium deficiency in the young vines. Actually, when we plant now, we just throw a little bit of pelleted chip in the planting hole. And then once they hit, and then we see some boron toxicity from the boron in the water in the young vines. But once they hit that calcium, they've got more calcium than they'll ever need.
Yeah.
Wow. Out here on the Texas plains, water is everything, and there's a resource that's as vital as it is fragile: our playa lakes. These lakes are nature's reservoir, catching rainwater to recharge our aquifer and provide lifelines for wildlife. But now they need our help. In collaboration with the Texas Playa Lakes Conservation Initiative and the Cargill Global Water Challenge, Sarah has started the Our Legacy is Tomorrow's Water initiative to inspire and work with landowners to restore and protect our playa lakes. Each playa we save helps secure a sustainable water future for the generations that will be coming after us. Whether it's improving soil health, restoring habitats, or recharging groundwater, we are committed to making a difference. Together, we can build a legacy that we can all be proud of. To learn how you can join in, visit the Playa Lakes Restoration Initiative page on the Sarah website. Let's keep Texas water flowing strong for the future. Visit sarah-conservation.com.
We have a very odd soil profile out here. It's if we had unlimited water, we could grow whatever you wanted to. Mm-hmm. It's a good growth medium, but it's predominantly sand in a lot of areas. Up north, at the Plainview Health Center, north of Lubbock area, that's more clay and holds more water. But down south, it's predominantly sand. That's where most of the vineyards are. Not all of them. There's a few people up there that are growing it, but where we've got the sand, we also typically don't apply hardly any nitrogen, but it's mostly because where our vineyard sites are, they've been growing cotton for 80 years and they put, way more nitrogen in it. The nitrogen leaches through the soil to the cleachy, semi-permeable cleachy down there. And then by the time your vines get to it, then you're like spending the next 10 years trying to not put any nitrogen on so you can pump the nitrogen out of the soil. Mm-hmm. And so you can get it back down to where the vines don't grow like gorillas.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about was in looking at your at the winery, the vineyard's website, you have a very unique blend of varieties that you have selected. and it made me feel comfortable because that's kind of like what we are out here. We've got a bunch of different things. But what went into your selection of the varieties that you did plant? Was it deliberately because of market need, or was it deliberately as a how they grow type issue?
Well, because this can be a pretty hot growing area, I wanted to select vines that come from areas that are hot and have proven to do well in hot climates. That was one of the criterias. Since that first vineyard that I put in the Chiricahuas, I was looking at. I actually kept a list of varieties that I thought would do well in that type of climate. The other factor in that was that, and so in this area, there's a lot of Cabernet being grown, some Merlot, some of kind of the mainstream varieties. And because we're small, the vineyard is just 25 acres at this point. I realized that our clientele for buying grapes was probably going to be some of these smaller producers that are making wine out of varieties that are a little bit more unusual, and rather than competing with the big guys. And so we got a little bit of input from those folks as well as far as what they were looking for. And then we're just going back to our list and saying, okay, well, let's try this and this. And some of the things, for instance, were accidental. I had planned on planting, Albarino. I think it was Albarino, and they didn't have any. And so, but they had a Certico. And the Certico is a Greek variety, and we ended up just getting that and planting that. And that is the Certico grown on this site almost sells out before it even goes on the market. So it's limited. It's grown in a kind of a unique way, and the winemakers are doing a good job of promoting the growing practices that we're using here. And so, right now, as of this year, we're working with 9 different wine growers, or winemakers, and they are all pretty small. They are all doing kind of unique stuff and kind of have have strong following for their wines. So that's been helpful in creating that market. We did plant some Cabernet just because we're trying to. This part of this is just inspiring others to think differently about how wine can be grown. And since our neighbors are doing a lot of Cabernet, we said we better do some Cabernet so that they don't just come over and say, well, you can do that with all those weird varieties, but you probably couldn't do it with Cabernet. So the first Cabernet crop was this year. So
I do not know how Cabernet grows on your site. For us out here, Cabernet is a very aggressive. It puts on a lot of canopy, and it works out pretty well for me because I get to skip irrigation on that block. When something like Roussanne, our white grape Roussanne, it needs the water. We got to keep watering. We basically keep watering the whites and stress the reds a little bit. But Cabernet is one that it is so aggressive and so vigorous that we can skip water to try to slow that down on that. But I would assume on your site, do you supplemental irrigate your vineyard, or is it completely dependent on rainfall?
It's irrigated.
Okay.
Which I'm going to say, at least at this moment, it has to be. I mean, we've had years with 2 inches of rain.
No, believe me, I understand 100% on that. We've got we may actually have the only 100% dry farmed vineyard. A block of grapes on the high plains, and it was a complete and utter accident. But it's in the bottom of a playa lake, and so every time it rains, it stands water, and so it's the only place that'll actually it's funny because we have lost fewer vines in it than we have where we irrigate. But I completely understand having to water that. Do you water with a subsurface drip, above ground drip, overhead irrigation? How do you irrigate that?
We do drip irrigation. The lines are just under the cordon, so they're high as well. And if I could do subsurface irrigation, that's what I would do. I don't think I can at this point because of our gopher pressure.
Yeah,
but we are, and I've done a lot of work in New Zealand, and the New Zealanders are big fans of this type of thinking, in part because they have they have more sheep than people. So, and the wine growers actually get paid to graze sheep. Whereas here we're paying the shepherds. In New Zealand, they're paying the stock producers are paying them as though it's just pasture land.
Yeah, they graze it they rent the vineyard floor to graze. Yeah.
Yep. Kind of back to the irrigation. Having our drip up high means that it's easy for humans. I mean, we can run a mower on a quad either direction. We can go between the vines or we can go down the rows. And so that allowed some management options, but also just having the sheep in there, I wanted as much out of the way as possible so that they could go in any direction. And we can set up fence in the vineyard in any direction. We can use either the electronet fencing, or we can use 2 or 3 strand electric polywire. And so that just gives us great opportunities to go in any direction. And that has actually allowed us to do some interesting testing. And I'll go back to that in a second. But what I did want to mention is that, so we do irrigate, but every year since we've started this project, our irrigation use goes down. Even during those dry years, the irrigation use is going down. And I think that is in part because our carbon levels are going up. And so, each 1% increase in soil carbon means about a 25,000 gallon increase in water holding capacity. And we're up to probably in some places close to 3% increase. So that means that we've increased our water holding capacity by, say, 75,000 gallons per acre.
Basically 3 acre inch. What is it? 20. There's an acre inch is 25,700 and something gallons. I believe.
Yeah, I actually don't know that off the top of my head.
I think that's right. So you basically added 3 inches of water holding capacity to your soil per acre.
Yeah.
So that's
huge.
Big savings through that.
Wow.
Yep. So that's kind of an ongoing thing of increasing the soil carbon, and we see that this year we had the soil ecologist from Australia named Christine Jones out at the ranch, and she had just done spent some time with a guy up in Indiana, I think it is, who is kind of the no-till organic guru, and John Kempf. And so he was pretty proud of his soil, and Christine Jones looked at it and said, I wouldn't be so proud of this. You've got some issues here. So when she was here, we went into the vineyard, and so we had I don't know, 60 people here or so for that workshop. And everybody said, well, let's look at the soil here and see what you think. And so she dug into the soil under the vines in the vine row, and she was very impressed. And she said, this is actually really remarkable what has happened to the soil here. And then someone said, well, let's check between, in the middle of the alleyways here. And Christine said, well, I don't think you'll be able to get a shovel in there. It hasn't rained in 6 months. And 2 women picked up a shovel, went over, and they said, hey, it's actually pretty easy to dig in here. And so we all went over and looked at that, and it just compounded this, the results of what has happened from our management practices, and that the soil has become more friable. It's got a lot more earthworms in it. It's more conducive to a diversity of plants and rodents. And so anyway, we feel like we're on the right track in that regard.
Yeah, that is so interesting, and I don't know how much that will carry over to sandy soil, but it would be interesting to see some of those things tried in our area. And I appreciate the fact that you're also looking at the bottom line, the economics of it, because what sounds good but doesn't pay is worthless.
Yeah, there's the 2 biggest trials. I assume that you're being on the Watson, you're hand harvesting your crop. Is that correct?
That is correct, but I will add to that before we put in the trellis system, I ran the trellis design by all of the grape harvesting companies that I know that are working in this area. And the outcome of that was that they could harvest that all of the companies on the West Coast that make machine harvesting, they could harvest the Watson, except for a little bit of side slope that we have on one of our blocks.
They use a trunk using a trunk shaker to shake it with.
I think most of them are using trunk shakers, but none of the European companies could do it. But we're 25 acres. It's not worth machine harvesting, and so we're doing that by hand. And that's another reason for the diversity of varieties, is that if we just had one or two varieties, we would have to harvest a bunch of stuff quickly by hand, and we just don't have the resources here for that. So with all these different varieties, they're coming off at different times, and it makes it pretty easy to get them all harvested without a big crew.
Yeah, but the other thing that would challenge, like our stuff up here, the machines up here harvesting are the European machines. They're a bow rod.
Yeah, because I couldn't imagine what I've seen here working.
But they do have. But there is. I don't even know if AGH still exists. American Grape Harvester still. I think they may still exist, but they used to make one that's a trunk shaker. The difference is, instead of shaking the upper canopy with the shoots to get them off, it holds the trunk and it shakes the trunk, thereby shaking the whole thing.
More like a tree shaker for a tree,
like
you
what
do
they
for
use
pistachios or pecans.
Yeah. And so that's a little bit different machine than what we have up here. The other thing that would concern me up here is that our soil is sandy, and so anywhere you have a plant growing, in a matter of weeks, if not days, you'll have a little clump of sand around that, and so your vineyard floor would be exceedingly rough going through. The few people that have done a permanent grass up here have run into that issue to an extent. Also, it builds up, because just because you've got good cover on yours, all it means is it's going to catch all the sand that's blowing from the other. So, but the theory behind the principle behind
windbreak around your vineyard so you could prevent that.
But it's phenomenal. I mean, the carbon increase in the soil. What is your soil pH? Is it relatively low, neutral, or high?
So the pH was high, and like into the high 7s, low 8s.
Okay. And
it started there, and it's now it's continually going down.
Yeah. I can see that if you're building carbon, you're going to be organic matter goes away very fast in a high pH soil. That's the bane of our existence up here is our soil pH is typically fairly high. The parent material on it is a high pH, and then we add water on it that is also high pH, hard water that's also high pH. And so organic matter does not tend to hang around in the soil very long. And so seeing that increase in carbon, the increase in carbon is probably the most phenomenal thing of everything that we've done. It takes a lot to increase the soil percent by 8%, much less 3%.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
So what variety of the varieties that you've picked, that you selected, and this is going off the regenerative and then kind of into an economics class section a little bit, which variety of yours is doing the best in terms of quality, and which one is doing the best in terms of yield?
Okay, so this year we were getting 5 tons to the acre for our Grenache, and we had to actually do that by looking at the vines that were mature. We have a loss. The first year of planting, we lost 2/3 of the vineyard, and that was a large part due to the nursery stock that had been underwater for all winter. So when we planted it, most of it never sprouted. We did have a fair bit of loss from squirrels as well, but so consequently, we had a diversity of age in the vineyard. But this last year, we were able to say, okay, let's just look at the yield off of the vines that are pretty close to being mature.
Yeah.
And so we were at 5 tons to an acre on that. And so that's and it'll probably go up a little bit from that. Eventually, as all the young vines and replants come into their maturity. So that's been a good producer for us, and it does well on this training system. Actually, we haven't found anything that isn't doing okay on this system. I mean, we had 17 varieties, and the Assertico has proven to be a low yielder, but it is also the most, for ease of production, it's like the Watson system was made for it, even though historically Assertico has been grown on the ground in like a bird nest thing.
Yeah.
And so we joked around that I joked around with my crews when they were first coming up. I would have little talks with them and saying, this might feel a little weird, but this is how you're meant to grow. And so they come up. The spur spacing is perfect. The canopy is kind of sparse, and it is one that actually grows all the way across and connects. And so it's very beautiful in its form out in the vineyard, but the yield is a little bit lower than the others. And so I think that the way that we'll eventually deal with that is to raise the price on that.
Yeah.
Verdejo has proven to be a really good white for us. Picpoul Blanc has been good as well.
It does well here as well.
Now I need to tell the tragedy story, our first big tragedy here. I guess that the first planting was a big tragedy, losing.
Sounds like it.
But this year's tragedy was voles. I had never seen a vole in this vineyard. Sally, who owns the ranch, has never seen a vole on the ranch in 25 years. And so we saw the voles and we thought, God, there's getting to be quite a few of them. And then we started noticing that they were doing a little bit of damage to the trunks. And about that time, I went to New Zealand to do some presentations and was gone for a couple of weeks. I got a text from the guy who's taking care of the vineyard, and he said, looks like we might end up losing a couple of these vines from the voles. They're so severe. By the time I got back from New Zealand, it was too late. And we're now looking at that we probably lost about 2/3 of the vineyard again. And that was from girdling. And I thought that it was because of our management practices, because we leave the vineyard floor covered with pretty thick grass, dead grass. And we've not done any tillage in the vineyard. Actually, we've not done any tillage on that site since we initially leveled it. We did do ripping on the first section, but we did not rip the entire second section. But then talking to neighbors, they were having a heck of a time with it too. And neighbors that were conventional and left bare ground. I do think that going forward, for instance, if next year, we, in the late winter, early spring, we saw a vole, we would probably assume the worst and graze severely and keep the vegetation down low. The other thing that we're going to do this year, we're assuming the worst for next year, we're going to put vine protectors on every vine, and those need to be buried at least 4 inches, and they need to be up above by probably a foot or so. And so we'll do that. And I'm even trying to find a metal version of a grow tube. Because they did chew through. We ended up putting grow tubes around everything, but they chewed through those.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So now that people haven't figured it out yet, that's kind of like a mouse, almost a mole. It's like it's a rodent.
Closer to a prairie dog.
Oh,
yeah, but it's about the size of a mouse, a little bit bigger, a little bit different color, and so in struggling to figure out how to manage these things, I called the neighbor who has the oldest vineyard in the area, about 70, 80 years old. And I asked him, I said, so did you get any damage? And he said, yeah, I lost 30% of my crop. And I said, when's the last time you had voles? And he said, 30 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And he said that was the first time, and he's probably as old as the vines.
Wow.
And so in his life, that was the first time he'd seen voles.
Wow.
And voles behave differently in different parts of the country. And I think they're basically just about everywhere. But in some of the wetter regions, they don't have these locust-like outbreaks. But in these drier areas, and we've had a few good rainfall years in a row, then we got the plague of voles.
Yeah. Well, this has been so good. I really appreciate it. Dusty, I appreciate you coming on to ask the right questions. And Kelly, thank you so much for graciously giving us your time. So much interesting information, and maybe some is applicable to us. What do you think, Dusty?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Kelly, keep up the good work and keep doing what you're doing. I think I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, someday I want to come and see Paicines Ranch. I'm like, it's on my bucket list. Yeah.
Yep, you have to do it.
Well, friends, thank you for joining us again for another episode of Conservation Stories. And one way you can help us, if you would, is to like and share this podcast. We would really appreciate that. That helps get us in front of other listeners. And it's a way that you can participate in what we're doing. So we look forward to visiting with you again on the next episode.